far beyond the edge of known star maps where the twin suns never sleep and the sky hums with ships from every corner of the galaxy. There stands the Grand Arena, a structure carved from blackstone and echoing with the roars of creatures and crowds. Alike a place where honor and power are earned, not by words but by the clash of flesh and steel in this place. Warriors from every world are brought to fight and bleed, and die for the amusement of those who sit above looking down from shining platforms, wearing silk robes and sipping from crystal goblets, with eyes that have long forgotten mercy among them today, sat the lords of the Krill Dominion, their faces filled with pride and arrogance, their laughter echoing across the stands as the name of the next challenger was announced, and it was a name that once caused silence. Now it only caused laughter. They called him Reed, once known as the Reaper of Kavos, a human soldier forged in the fire of 100 wars, but what stepped into the pit today looked nothing like the stories. He was older now, with silver creeping through his hair, and lines etched deep in his face. One arm hung heavy, and his limp was obvious, every movement showing the pain buried deep in bone and memory. His armor was dented, mismatched, barely holding together, and in the eyes of the crowd, he was nothing more than a relic, something dragged out from the past to serve as a joke, a walking corpse sent to amuse them before it was thrown away for good. But Reed said nothing. He simply walked forward across the sand that had soaked the blood of 1,000 lost fighters, his gaze steady, his breath calm, his body slow but deliberate. And as he reached the center of the arena, a great gate creaked open, revealing a beast twice his size, muscle layered over bone, with eyes glowing red and metal claws gleaming in the sun. This creature was bred for the pit, born to kill, trained to destroy everything in its path, and today the crowd believed it would rip the human apart in seconds. They cheered wildly, placing bets, throwing tokens and digital credits, shouting names, none of which belonged to Reed. Up in a golden cage near the arena's throne stood Lyra, the enslaved alien princess, her posture stiff, her eyes distant, her chains heavy enough to silence even her thoughts. Once a symbol of peace between empires, now reduced to a prize to be claimed by the winner of today's fight. She had seen many fall before this day, warriors of strength and speed who screamed as they were broken beneath the claws of monsters. Now she looked down and saw only another foolish soul sent to die, another man already forgotten. But something shifted as the announcer's voice faded and the gates slammed shut behind them. Reed did not take a stance. He did not roar or beat his chest like others had done. Instead, he stood still, eyes locked on the creature before him, his hands loose at his sides as if waiting for something deeper than muscle and might to carry him through. The crowd grew impatient. Some began to boo, others laughed louder, but a few paused, their gaze narrowing, watching the way Reed breathed, like he was not just standing there, but listening, feeling every vibration, every step, every breath in the dust. The beast charged with a sound like thunder, the ground trembling under its weight, its claws ready to tear through flesh and bone. But Reed moved at the last second, his body twisting, his bad leg dragging just enough to throw off the rhythm, but his hand snapped out like lightning, striking the side of the beast's head. And though the blow was not enough to drop it, the motion stunned it just slightly enough for Reed to step back and reset. Crowd went quiet for just a heartbeat, just long enough to feel something change, just long enough for one of the older warlords to lean forward, eyes narrowing, not in mockery but in interest, and Lyra too leaned slightly forward, her breath catching as she looked closer, not at his wounds, not at his weakness, but at the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned every inch of his enemy. Not like a fighter trying to win, but like a soldier trying to survive. Reed knew this dance. He had done it 100 times before against creatures far worse in places far darker, and though his body screamed with pain, though every movement reminded him of years lost, he remembered one thing above all: he was still human, and humans do not quit. They do not bend to fear or pain or doubt. They do not listen when the world tells them they are finished. And so he stood in the center of the arena with the crowd mocking and the creature roaring and the chains of the alien princess gleaming in the sun, and though he was broken the weight of failure clung to him like ash. He raised his fists not in pride, not for glory, but because he was not done, not ever. The bondism. Air was thick with heat and noise, and the pulse of 1,000 restless watchers, pounding like a storm around the arena. But Reed did not hear the noise, and he did not see the faces above. He focused only on the beast before him, its muscles twitching, its massive shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm of fury, its sharp claws scraping against the stone floor, ready to spill blood. As soon as the signal gave way, again it came forward, faster this time, heavier, like a battering ram trying to end the fight before it even began. But Reed turned his body just enough to avoid the full weight of the charge. His left leg nearly buckled, but he kept his balance through sheer instinct, letting the creature crash into the wall behind him in a burst of dust and stone. The crowd gasped, some of them on their feet, now watching closer than before. This was not the pitiful show they had expected. This was not the slow death of a forgotten warrior. This was something different, something that whispered of old stories, the kind told in back halls about the humans and their refusal to surrender no matter how broken their bodies might become. And as Reed circled the beast, eyes never blinking, shoulders tense, he began to see the rhythm in its steps, the pauses between its swings, the hesitation after every missed strike. The beast roared, turning with wild force, blood dripping from its mouth, not its own but from a dozen past victims, now mixed in the dirt beneath their feet. It launched forward again, swinging with both arms, claws slashing through the air. One caught Reed's arm, tearing through the worn leather and carving a line across his skin, but he did not flinch, and he did not slow. Instead, he stepped closer into the creature's reach, where its bulk became a weakness, where its power could not save it, and he drove his elbow into its throat hard enough to make it stumble back, gasping and coughing with rage. Above in the royal cage, Lyra leaned closer, her hands gripping the bars, not because she hoped for his victory, but because she no longer understood how he was still standing. His leg was dragging worse now, blood falling freely from his arm, sweat soaking through the cloth around his chest, but his eyes never lost focus. They burned not with hatred, not with pride, but with something far more dangerous, a fire that no chains could break and no pain could drown. And in that fire she saw the truth. He was not fighting to win, he was fighting because he refused to lose. Reed remembered the labs, he remembered the cold hands of machines, and the needles that tore through his nerves. He remembered the sound of screaming that wasn't always his own, and he remembered the silence afterward, when the wars ended, and his name meant nothing, and no one came for him. But here in this place, beneath the eyes of the same kind of monsters who once tried to turn him into a weapon, he found the perfect answer, not with speeches, not with mercy, but with movement, with pain, with fire. The beast attacked again, more cautious, now more aware of the threat Reed posed, and their fight turned from a slaughter into a dance, a brutal rhythm of dodges and strikes and counters. Reed did not have speed, but he had timing. He did not have strength, but he had precision, and with each step, he drew the creature into traps of its own anger, letting it waste its energy on empty strikes while he answered with sharp hits to joints and soft tissue, each blow small but cutting deeper than it looked. And then it happened in a moment too quick for the eye to fully follow. Reed fainted left, dropped low, and drove a broken spear tip hidden in the sand straight into the beast's leg, just below the knee. The creature screamed and fell staggering to one side, and the crowd, who had laughed, now shouted, not with joy, but with disbelief, their laughter dying in their throats, replaced by something they had not expected to feel: fear. Lyra stood frozen, her heart pounding, as she watched the creature rise again, slower this time, weaker, and Reed standing across from it, covered in dust and blood, breathing heavy but still upright, still ready. She saw no armor of light, no blade of destiny, no shield from fate. He was only a man, but that was what made it worse, that was what made it real, because he was not supposed to survive, not here, not like this. The arena had turned, and those who had wagered fortunes began to feel the burn of loss creeping through their veins. And still Reed moved, not with speed, but with the certainty of someone who had faced death too many times to be afraid now. Every muscle in his body screamed, every step burned, every breath cut like ice, but he kept going, not because he believed in victory, but because surrender was never part of who he was. And in that moment, with the sun above him and the crowd around him and the beast in front of him snarling and limping and bleeding, Reed felt no triumph, only clarity, and he whispered words to himself. Not loud enough for the crowd, not loud enough for Lyra, just loud enough for the pain to hear, I am still here. And that was enough. The sun kept climbing higher above the arena, casting long streaks of gold and fire across the battlefield, where blood soaked the sand and shadows danced like ghosts, and yet Reed remained standing, his chest rising slow and heavy, his arm torn open, his leg dragging worse with every step. But there was no fear in his eyes and no doubt in his hands, only focus deeper than the silence that followed each clash between human and beast. The crowd that once howled with laughter now sat hushed, leaning forward with breath caught between awe and confusion, for they had seen the human bleed. They had seen him stumble, but they had not seen him fall across. From him the beast no longer moved with pride or rage. Its muscles trembled and its eyes blinked. Too often sweat dripped down its scaled skin, and blood poured from the wound in its leg, where the broken spear still jutted out like a warning. Its breath came loud and rough, and it looked at Reed not as a predator, but as something uncertain, as if the man before it had turned into something else, something more dangerous than the monster it thought it was facing. Reed's mind swam in pain. Memories rising and falling like waves from the past, voices calling out through the fog of time, comrades lost in the ruins of war, faces he could barely remember, but still carried in his bones voices that reminded him of the promise he once made, the one he never spoke aloud, the one he lived by with every step he took. Never stop, no matter what, never give them the ending they expect. He shifted his weight forward, each movement costing more than the last, his broken body moving not because it was strong, but because it had learned how to move through agony, his fists clenched and unclenched, blood sticking to the lines of his fingers, and he eyed the creature now panting and circling, its gaze flickering toward the gates as if wondering whether escape was allowed, as if for the first time it questioned whether the fight was worth it. In the royal cage, Lyra no longer sat still. She pressed her hands against the cold metal, eyes wide and unblinking, watching Reed not with pity but with something else, something like hope wrapped in disbelief. Her chains rattled when she leaned too far forward, but she did not care. She had seen thousands fall in the arena, but this was different. This man was not just surviving, he was teaching the crowd a lesson carved into every bruise on his skin and every drop of blood in the dirt. The beast struck again, driven more by instinct than purpose, its claws slashing wild and desperate, but Reed ducked low and twisted his body, letting the attack sail over his head. His shoulder crashed into the creature's ribs, and the sound of bone cracking echoed across the pit. The creature howled, stumbling sideways, eyes wild and unfocused, its strength fading and its fury turning to panic. Reed felt the pain like fire under his skin, but he did not stop. He followed the hit with another, a brutal punch to the side of the neck, and then a kick aimed at the same wounded leg. His timing was slow but perfect, each strike deliberate, each one breaking the beast piece by piece. And still the crowd said nothing, their silence louder than any cheer, their faces pale as they watched the impossible unfold in front of them. The arena masters shifted in their seats, guards stood tense near the edges of the sands, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether what they were seeing was allowed by rules never imagined would be broken this way. And far above, where bets were placed and fortunes exchanged, whispers of doubt began to spread. Like cracks through stone, people who had wagered everything on a quick kill now watched their greed turn to dread. Reed's breath came harder now, his legs shaking, his vision swimming, but his mind was clear every time he had fallen in life, every time he had been told it was over. He had risen again, not because he was unbreakable, but because being broken never stopped him from moving forward. He did not fight for glory or revenge or gold. He fought because giving up was never part of who he was. Creature stumbled again, dropping to one knee, claw digging into the sand as it tried to rise. But Reed was already there, swinging with every ounce of strength left in his body. His fist connected with the side of its head, and the beast collapsed with a crash that sent dust flying and silence rolling across the stands. He stood over it, chest heaving, arms limp, blood dripping freely from wounds too deep to count, and he looked up, not to the crowd, not to the masters, but to the cage where Lyra stood, her eyes meeting his through the heat and the dust, and something passed between them, not words, not gestures, only the shared truth that freedom could only be taken by those willing to fight for it, even if it meant dying 1 inch at a time. And so, Reed stood in the broken light among the wreckage of his enemy, breathing slow and deep, not waiting for praise, not needing applause, only standing tall because he could, because he must, because he was still not done. Silence that followed the beast's fall stretched long and wide through the great arena, as if time itself had stopped to watch. What had just happened? The creature that was bred for war, designed to destroy, had collapsed into the dust, and there stood the man they had called broken, the human they had mocked and forgotten, standing tall, wounded and shaking, but still alive. Still breathing, still unbowed. The crowd that once shouted with laughter now sat still, their mouths open, their eyes wide, unable to believe what they had just seen. The impossible had happened, and it had not come with lightning or power or magic, but with grit and pain and something they had never understood about humans: the will to keep moving no matter the cost. Reed felt the blood in his mouth and tasted metal, but he did not fall. He stared up toward the golden platform where the lords of the arena sat, and for the first time since the fight began, they were no longer smiling. One of them rose with a sharp gesture, shouting in a voice full of authority that this match could not be accepted, that something had gone wrong, that the rules had been broken. But the crowd did not cheer for him. They did not respond to his voice. They only watched Reed, and in that moment they understood that they had witnessed something rare and real, something that could not be undone with words or titles. The chains around Lyra's wrists were cold and heavy, but she no longer felt their weight. Her eyes remained locked on the man below, on the dust and blood and silence that now belonged to him. She had seen champions win and lose and die, but never had she seen someone fight like this, not for reward, not for rage, not for pride, but for the simple reason that giving up was not in his blood. She gripped the bars of her cage and took a breath that felt different from all the ones before. It felt like air that could carry change. Reed slowly stepped back from the beast's body, his leg nearly giving under him, but he caught himself and kept walking toward the center of the arena, where the old stone circle marked the victor's place. According to the ancient code written long before the arena had grown into this place of cruelty, the winner claimed the prize, not the gold, not the cheers, but the living prize chosen for the fight. And standing in chains above him was Lyra, the daughter of a fallen empire, now offered as reward to those who could prove themselves worthy. Another arena master stepped forward from the side, his robe trailing behind him, his voice trying to sound calm as he declared that the match must be reviewed, that a wounded man could not be trusted, that the creature must have been weakened. But the words fell empty. The people had already chosen what they believed, and what they believed was standing in front of them, covered in blood, with eyes that did not blink. Guards moved toward the cage where Lyra stood waiting for orders, but the moment had already passed, because Reed raised his hand, not with a sword, not with a weapon, just his open palm, and in that simple motion something ancient stirred within the crowd and across the systems, where people watched through glass screens and signal towers, because here was a man who did not demand his reward. He claimed it not with greed, but with purpose. Lyra's cage opened slowly, the sound of metal grinding as her chains were released one by one, falling to the floor with a soft ring. Her steps were cautious, but sure as she descended from her prison, her eyes never leaving Reed's face, and though her body carried the scars of captivity, her presence held something stronger than fear, something that even the arena masters could not name the moment she stepped onto. The sand beside him, the air itself shifted. One of the warlords rose from his chair, fury boiling across his face, shouting that this was an insult, that the laws of the pit had been twisted, that the girl must return to the cage, that the human must be punished. But his voice was not met with support. It echoed into silence, broken only by the sound of Reed's breath. Steady and full of fire, Reed turned to Lyra, and his words were quiet but strong, and they carried through the dust and blood across the whole arena. You are free now, and no one owns you, and no one ever will again. And Lyra looked at him, not as a savior, not as a master, but as an equal. And in that look, something shattered in the old world, something that could never be rebuilt. The crowd rose, not all at once, but in waves, people cheering, not for victory, but for the truth that had been buried. For too long, the truth that strength was not in size or power, but in heart and will and refusal to break. And Reed stood in the center of it all, not smiling, not waving, just standing, because this was not a performance. This was who he was. Lyra stood beside him, not behind, and in that moment, the chains that had held them both in different ways began to lose their grip, and across the stars, where systems had long forgotten what humans were capable of, whispers began to rise like sparks in dry grass. The broken man had not only survived, he had changed everything. Arena stood still long after the dust had settled, and the crowd had roared, and the old rules had shattered under the weight of something no one could touch, and no one could control. The man they had called broken had not just won a fight. He had reminded the stars of something they had long forgotten, something buried under greed and cruelty and tradition. The simple, unstoppable truth that humans, when pushed to the edge, do not fall, they rise. And when Reed turned from the center of the pit, his shoulders burned and his legs trembled, but his eyes were calm and unshaken. Beside him walked Lyra, no longer a symbol, no longer a prize, no longer a voice silenced by chains. She walked with steps that grew stronger with every breath. She took away from the place that once held her as property. The stares of the crowd followed them both, not with pity or amusement, but with awe and disbelief, as if they were watching something impossible unfold in front of them, as if they had just seen a future being written without permission. Warlords did not speak now, their faces locked in fury and silence, their plans ruined, their games exposed. And as the crowd continued to chant and whisper and rise to their feet, something deep in their perfect palaces began to shake, not from weapons or machines, but from fear of what this story would become once it left these walls, once it reached the broken colonies and forgotten moons, once it touched the minds of those who had waited too long for something to believe. Reed said nothing to the crowd. He gave no speech, he made no gesture. He simply walked, and his steps were louder than words, because each one said, I am still here, and each one said, you cannot bury fire forever. And Lyra followed, not because she was bound, but because she chose to. And that choice was the beginning of something the masters could never undo. They reached the gates of the arena, where guards stepped aside, not from orders, but from hesitation, something in their hearts pulling them away from the path. They had always known something telling them that maybe this time they were on the wrong side, and Reed did not look at them as enemies. He simply passed, as if daring them to stop him, as if inviting them to try, and none of them moved. Outside the arena, the city that once turned its back on humans now watched with new eyes. Screens flickered with his image, names once forgotten now repeated across markets and alleys and towers built on pride and silence. Children pointed and asked questions their parents had no answers for, and the older ones, those who had seen the rise and fall of empires, whispered in corners that the age of control was breaking at last. Reed and Lyra found a ship hidden in rust and shadow, forgotten like the man who now stepped inside its cold hull, and they did not wait for permission or blessing or reward. They simply left silent engines carrying them into the stars, away from the world that had tried to end them, and toward whatever would come next. And Lyra asked him once, as the stars unfolded across the window, why he had fought so hard when he had nothing. Left when no one believed, and Reed sat quiet for a moment, before answering, not with stories or sorrow, but with truth. They laughed and I remembered, because they forgot who we were. And I did not, and Lyra said nothing more, for there was nothing left to say, only the stars ahead, and the weight of chains left behind in time. Their story spread not as rumor, but as fire across systems, ruled by fear, across stations where the poor waited for change, across minds where workers dreamed in silence. The legend of the broken human and the freed princess became something more than tale. It became a spark in the hearts of those who had none. It became a call to rise, a reason to stand, and across the void others began to move, others began to believe. Far from the arena where it all began, two figures moved from planet to planet, never staying long, never taking power, only leaving behind whispers and courage, and the memory of a fight that was never supposed to be won but was, and the truth they left behind burned brighter than any crown or coin, that pain is not defeat and freedom must be claimed and humans do not break. The story was over, and yet it was only just beginning, because legends do not end, they only pass from one voice to another. Across the stars forever, the end.